Good morning, everybody. I would like to start with a quote. So there are three eras of assets. So it's the commodity-based era, it's the authority-based, and the math-based. And especially the last one is one that is very interesting, and it's also a one that requires change in mind, also from a regulatory perspective. And in this panel, we would like to look at the crypto regulation and DeFi regulation unfolding in Switzerland, the European Union, and the UK. Unfortunately, not the US, because the US panelist is sick and cannot attend, but I think it gives us even more time to focus on the EU, Europe, and Switzerland. And I'm very happy to have in the panel two very well-known experts for UK, Europe, and Liechtenstein. So please welcome Diego and Thomas. Maybe Diego, a few words about yourself.
Thank you, Ronnie. My name is Diego Vallonosio. I am a partner at Clifford Chance. I'm normally based in London, and I specialize in financial services regulation and have been thinking about the regulatory impact of both non-backed crypto assets, the bitcoins of this world, and also digital securities, which we're going to talk about later today.
So now I should introduce myself.
Yeah.
My name is Thomas Engel. I'm a lawyer in Liechtenstein. I was a coder before I became a lawyer. My work life is fully dedicated to blockchain, actually. I did write a PhD about the legal nature of tokens, about tokenization of assets. I wrote my master thesis about the secondary market for securities. And we as a law firm in Liechtenstein, we do, actually 80% of our work is somehow blockchain related, and I was also part of the work group of the Liechtenstein government to actually draft that Liechtenstein Blockchain Act, or TVTG as it is known.
Thank you very much. So for this panel, we would like to structure it in different parts. So first of all, we start with the crypto regulation, where we focus on crypto assets that not qualify as securities, then we look at crypto assets qualifying as securities, and then we go also into DeFi regulation. Just for your understanding, if we talk about crypto assets qualifying as securities, then we mean bonds, equity-based or derivative-based, typical financial market instrument, and with other crypto assets, it's usually the payment utility type of tokens. So let's start. Thomas, how are crypto assets regulated in the EU, and how MiCA now comes into play?
At the moment, there is no universal understanding or one common understanding in Europe about what a crypto asset is. The marketing crypto assets regulation, the MiCA, is not yet in force. It's going to be in force in December 2024. We will have the final version end of June. It's going to be published end of June. And then we actually know what, at least in Europe, is a crypto asset. So we have a legal definition of what a crypto asset is. At the moment, you have several different approaches, right? In Liechtenstein, you have a different understanding what a token is in comparison to, for example, Germany or Spain or Austria or wherever. And this is going to be harmonized throughout the European Union and European Economic Area. And Liechtenstein is a part of the European Economic Area, so that has an influence on our regulation as well. So for the moment, it's not very clear. It's really jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But when we have MiCA, we have one definition throughout Europe and one understanding. And I think the most crucial part, and that's why it is called marketing crypto assets regulation, this MiCA is focusing on crypto assets, not the securities part as you already outlined. It's
okay, but does that mean there is a clear definition of what a crypto asset is in the future?
Yes, that is pretty clear. Yeah, okay. And you have like a certain type of assets, reference tokens. You have crypto assets as this universal definition, and then you have a subset of specific types with specific rules depending on the risk factors and the level of protections that they want to have. So, for example, one of the highly regulated area under MiCA is stablecoins, right? That is a clear focus on that is going to be highly regulated.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So, Diego, now you with the EU view and the UK view, so how MiCA comes into play? I mean, it's a very broad term. What does it actually mean? So you can be a simple token issuer, you can also be a crypto asset service provider. I think they are called now CASP and not anymore VASP. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two aspects. The first one is there is a definition of crypto asset, as Thomas was saying. The slight problem with that is that the definition is incredibly broad. It covers lots of things. And so I think we're going to feel our ways around some of the fringe areas as to where that definition sits. But what we have clearly is three buckets of crypto assets. We've got the unbacked crypto assets, the bitcoins, then we've got the stable coins, and then we've got those that are excluded from MiCA because they qualify as securities. And to an extent, we had that in the UK already as part of the implementation of anti-money laundering requirements that were stipulated by the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. The UK currently requires firms that deal in those unbacked crypto assets to register as a crypto asset services provider. And MiCA effectively, I think, does that, but much better, because it deals with the three layers of the life cycle of the asset. It starts off with there is a regime for the issuance of the asset, and there's different requirements and basically a disclosure requirement like a prospectus for unbacked and stable coins. Then you've got all the trading elements. This is, people that are familiar with securities trading. This is the MiFID piece. So the secondary market aspects of trading is covered. Those are the crypto asset services providers. And here you've got different types of activities that are regulated, arranging, dealing, activities that were familiar from a securities life cycle. And then you've got on top the market abuse regime that covers trading in crypto assets, but not just for regulated entities, but for anybody who is active in the market. And so what MiCA does is it sort of replicates the position that you've got for securities in a single regulatory framework. It's really interesting. And the UK is now sort of trying to do the same. There has been a consultation out which is closed very recently, whereby the idea is that you would bring crypto assets, these unbacked crypto assets and stablecoins, within the framework of the Financial Services and Markets Act, which is essentially what gives the regulatory authorities the power to issue rules and create specific mandates. And that also includes provisions in respect of the issuance. So there will be a prospectus type white paper requirement. And then you've got aspects around secondary trading, and then you'll have a market abuse regime. All of that is coming, and it's very similar. The UK is trying to differentiate itself in that it is going maybe slightly beyond what MiCA is doing in the detail. Sadly, we have not seen that detail yet. I've been in discussions with Treasury and with other people, and it is clear that there is an ambition to create a MiCA Plus framework that's better, more flexible, and more to the point, but we haven't seen it yet.
Okay, I mean, that's very interesting, and it's a very different approach. So Switzerland, basically, what they did, they looked at it and said whether something is related to the financial market or not. And if it's not related to the financial market, then they treat it as everything else outside of the financial market. And what I think interesting now with the EU and the UK is that even as a non-financial assets, you have to have something like a white paper, which is a little bit like the prospectus then, and you need maybe notification or authorization. But I'm wondering, I mean, now that all comes out of the ICO time where people did these public sales, and in my opinion, in practice, the time is over, so sales are done in a different way. And I'm wondering whether this regulation is just regulating something in the past and not what's going on now. I don't know, maybe, Thomas, you can...
I have a view on that. If you look at why MiCA was actually created, I already touched on the stablecoin issue, which is actually trying to be addressed with MiCA. But it came also from the understanding that how you finance companies in Europe is completely different than the financing of companies in the United States, right? So for us, normally actually banks should provide that money for startups, which is not really working very, very well. And if you look at the documents alongside MiCA and the explanatory documents, it was also driven by the understanding that this is a huge opportunity for Europe, that companies can fund their projects with a new method, right? And so that's why ICOs are not forbidden under MiCA. They're allowed, right? There's a clear path. What you have to do is you have to issue a white paper, and it's a clear path. And the good thing is, and that is maybe part of the reason why we don't see as much ICOs anymore, because we knew sooner or later regulatory scrutiny kicked in, right? There were offerings out of Switzerland, and then the US said, oh my gosh, as soon as you touch any US investor, we think we have jurisdiction, right? I mean, we're not US attorneys, so it's actually sad that we don't have the US perspective here, but that was one of the bigger challenges, right? And the same is true if you issue an ICO out of Switzerland or out of Liechtenstein, and even if you have regulatory clarity within Switzerland from FINMA or from Liechtenstein or wherever from Germany, the problem is that's only local law. So when you want to actually market your product to a bigger audience, you have to actually go jurisdiction by jurisdiction, which costs a lot of money on the one hand. In a lot of jurisdictions, you don't get that regulatory clarity. So try to ask whatever country you can imagine in Europe, or try to get a clear picture of what is possible and what is not, and that is just not available. But that brings me actually to the big value of this harmonized MiCA approach. The harmonized MiCA approach allows you to start your project in one European Union, European Economic Area country, and then passport that throughout Europe. So you deal with one regulator, you get your white paper, and then you can actually actively market it to a 400 million plus market. 400 million plus is the biggest market so far with one license when we have MiCA in place. And I think that is the big advantage we see here. And I really do believe that, and I hope that this way of getting your business funded is coming back under a clear regime, under clear rules, with consumer protection rules, but also with legal certainty for the project issuing and using that route to finance their company. And I think that is the added value there. So I hope that we will see that we get back ICOs. Because it's not bad. It's not bad. That's a clear statement. ICOs are not bad, right?
Yeah. But I mean, the question is it the regulator that have to enable something that maybe the community doesn't want anymore?
May I react to what Thomas was saying? Yeah. I think it's absolutely true that that's the purpose. I think we sort of need to distinguish between the types of ICOs that we'll see. I'm much more in Thomas's camp in the context of stable coins and asset reference tokens, which have a backing. I'm less certain that you'll see utility coins like proper unbacked assets created through ICOs, and that will meaningfully create an investor base that would allow projects to be funded properly to large extents. Why? Because the big difference with the security space is that you need institutional investors to buy into the asset. And if an institutional investor is not able to get any guarantee that they're going to get a performance out of that asset, and you don't know really what you're backing, then it's not attractive because you've got investment guidelines as an institution to meet. So I'm less optimistic on pure sort of unbacked utility token ICOs being a novel way of funding projects. It may kick off in maybe in the retail scene. Yes, but large projects that are going to do what we've seen a few years back, I think I'm less optimistic on that. I do think that financial institutions are able to leverage the asset reference tokens framework in particular, because that allows you to tokenize things. You can basically put any asset underlying the token and create liquidity in that asset via that framework, which I think is very interesting for regulated financial institutions, and you can see how that could actually get an institutional backing. I'm with you. The EU has the only way in which it can create regulatory framework is through legislation. That's what the EU does. It's a regulating machine. It can only issue legislation. And I think this is an example of where they're trying to create a market through legislation. We'll see whether it's going to work or not, but those were sort of my hesitations with it.
Mm-hmm. But so you quickly mentioned retail. So, I mean, maybe as a large retailer, you may be interested in doing a pure utility token, which is not asset-backed, but would, for example, an airdrop of token be exempted, or do you also then have to go through these compliance steps?
No, so it's about the activities. The activity will be offering the token, and whether you do it via airdrop or by offering the token. If you're doing it for free, that's probably okay. But if you're doing it by way of business and getting anything for your token, then you'll be in this offering category, and you'll be caught by the white paper requirement.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, yeah?
That is pretty clear. Airdrops are covered, and if you do something for free, it's exempted. But if you, for example, collect private data, so if you collect email addresses and stuff, it's already in the focus again. So
okay.
It's already in scope again. And I think just to add to your point, Diego, I think what you have to do is, if you look at the offerings, which were really purely utility offerings with a good use case, right? I think that this is going to come back. But the big picture, I do agree there. And we did the first security token offering in for example, in August 2018 to use this technology to passport then actually this prospectus to all of Europe. But the problem is that never took off. We all know why. We have no liquidity. We have no secondary market, right? So that's one of the bigger challenges. And I do also agree on that if you issue an assets reference token or an e-money token, which is the other class you can actually issue. But that is not for funding projects, right? I think that there is gonna be a niche, right? And if this niche is just used wisely, I think we will see more of these offerings again.
Mm-hmm. So, Thomas, you made a bold statement before that you have one license and then a huge market. So, does that mean it doesn't matter anymore where you incorporate in the European Union?
Oh, yes, it does matter. But yes, that one license access to Europe, that's the big beauty of MiCA, right? That is the big beauty of having a harmonized legal framework throughout Europe, one level playing field. And this is only possible because it is directly applicable in all of the European Union member states. So they cannot say we want to have it like completely different or we adopt it in a different way. We are very familiar with that in the financial market space, right, with MiFID and all of these regulations. So, but on the other hand, there are, and this is the same game again, where do you start your company, right? I mean, first of all, if you can do it home, I always tell everybody, if you can do it in your home country, don't cross any border, try to do it in your home country. But then what are the questions? First of all, it's not only about having a regulation in place, you also have to think about with which regulator I am dealing. Is it one regulator in the country? Is it several regulators? Are they experienced? Do they understand? Because you have to imagine that all of the European Union regulators, even if their strategy so far was to block everything, now they have to work along, they have to work towards MiCA, so they have to get educated, they have to staff up, they have to do all of that, like in for example, Switzerland, they have a long tradition, the FINMA, so they have a lot of knowledge. They saw a lot of projects. We already addressed a lot of these challenges, right? They are going to face first now, starting from 2024, when they get the first applicants, right? So experience is a very crucial point. And then there are the other ones, like the talent, right? How can you source talent? That's one of the bigger challenges we have in Liechtenstein, right? There is no local market, so you basically have to have an OPCO or something in Zurich and then the regulatory headquarter in Liechtenstein to access Europe, for example. that's another big question. You need an ecosystem, right? And then there are like a lot of other small questions, tax-wise, that might matter, right? But there are a lot more questions or a lot more requirements to have a successful startup. So I think the jurisdiction still will matter, and that choose is very crucial. And like the elephant in the room is that for Switzerland, you don't have access to that framework, right, with Switzerland. And actually the same is true for UK, even if you have the same level of regulation. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually advocating for having equivalency in MiCA, right? We don't have equivalency rules. There are no equivalency provisions. And just for the ones who don't know what equivalency means, even if you have the same level of regulation, as long as there are no equivalency provisions in the MiCA framework, you cannot actually have this easy access to that market. We have that, for example. One example is in the securities world, where you have equivalency provisions that third countries can actually access the European framework. And that is not true for MiCA. We hope that we get that in MiCA version 2, that then Switzerland and the UK, if you have the same level of regulation, can easily access that market again.
Yeah, but I mean, that's also on the other way around. I mean, we also don't acknowledge MiCA. I mean, Diego, I mean, we're obviously sitting in the same boat, so I mean, how is it like for a UK company or a Swiss company if you want to go into the EU? I think we have to distinguish between a pure issuer and a service provider. So can you still do that, or do you need to have a rep office as you need to have under the GDPR, or what would you?
So I think I mean, this is sort of what I do. My focus on internationals, trying to access EU, UK, and other jurisdictions, and I think the typical discussion goes along the lines of where do we find a place where we can set up our hub. And I think that the factors that Thomas was talking about are spot on. I mean, it's about, you know, what's the tax aspect here, what's the knowledge of the regulator, how will I be treated, blah blah blah. But then once you've established, okay, there is this hub, how do you actually access other jurisdictions? And here, for example, the UK in the security space is really, really open. Like Switzerland, it allows cross-border trade. If you're not set up there, it allows cross-border trade into security. So one of the things that people have been advocating in response to the recent consultation was, let's try to create this overseas persons framework also for crypto assets. And the way that would look potentially is that if you want to service retail clients, you'll need a local base, but that could be, for example, a crypto broker. And then you've got your exchange or your liquidity in Europe. You have a broker that's accessing that liquidity via a local entity. And that is possible. We've seen that in the banking space. And so then you've got two types of activities. You've got a brokerage intermediary that sits in the UK or in Switzerland, somewhere else, and they can tap into the liquidity of the main hub, which is in Europe. Trick with this is you need to satisfy the regulators on both sides that whatever substance is in place in their location is in line with their expectations. So if you've got a big exchange, that needs to have adequate personnel, substance, people. Regulators want, you know, bodies there to sit down if there's a problem. That's what it is. And so as long as you can satisfy that, there are ways in which you can make arrangements, but you'll have to go through this painful process of getting another license and another investment and another regime. I am, to be honest, really skeptical about equivalence. Equivalence, in my view, is there, but it's never worked, not properly, and I don't think will ever work, particularly the way jurisdictions, regulatory approaches are going. They're more inwards looking, and you can see it in MiCA. MiCA is incredibly inward focused, and you know, it's basically even cutting down on reverse solicitation, which was the usual way in which services are offered in Europe. So I am less optimistic on the ability of having equivalence. We may end up, and this is, I think, something that's on the table between Switzerland and the UK at the moment, is some sort of regulatory deference where you recognize that somebody is authorized by a regulator that's credible, that there is a proper regime in place, and you sort of make it easier for them to jump through those hoops and, you know, provide certain facilities. We've got that at the moment in the UK. There is a framework for certain exchanges, for example, the recognized investment exchanges framework, it's called, where you can get an exemption if you're already licensed in your home jurisdiction. Something like that I see certainly between UK and Switzerland as a possibility. Between UK and the EU, I think Brexit is still too fresh. We're going to see movement toward that in a few years, but not yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Thomas, something to add?
No, actually, that is very unrealistic to get it equivalency. It's for sure also maybe a political strategy, right? To don't get that access to the European market that easily, right? So
yeah,
it might,
it's
for sure, right?
Competition between jurisdictions.
It might be a competition, but if you put that on a larger scale, I mean, if you go, and again, it's a pity that we don't have the US perspective, because we are all over Europe, right? So I think we are going to have a more interconnected European ecosystem. And if you go a little bit, like Switzerland and Liechtenstein was working together since 2016 with a lot of projects where we said, this is better in Switzerland, this is better in Liechtenstein, that's the best way to combine these two jurisdictions, right? We did that in some respect to Germany as well. But I think the bigger competition when it comes to competition is actually going to be East or West, right? So as long as the US is not getting their things together, right, it's very, very good for Europe, right? If you talk in the United States about we have our things together in Europe, be it in Switzerland for the security token market, which is like the secondary market is very well organized in Switzerland, right? And maybe we can touch on that later a bit if that is of interest.
Yeah, maybe let's jump into that now because time is running, sorry. So now I think it's a good time to talk about security tokens and also about infrastructure for digital assets. I mean, as everyone knows, Switzerland was very fast again, so we introduced DLT trading systems, which means basically that you can run an infrastructure where you do basically the trading, the clearing and settlement, and also allow access to retail clients. This sounds very promising, but unfortunately no license has been granted yet. I know there are multiple projects applying for a license, but no such exchange exists. I mean, there is SIX, which is still operating as a normal exchange with DLT as technology, but it's not a DLT trading system yet. So, of course, also in the EU and in the UK, there are initiatives regarding the infrastructure. So on the one hand, we have the EU pilot regime, and then in the UK, we have the FMI sandbox. And of course, it would be interesting for the audience to better understand what that means. Maybe, Diego, you can shed some light on that.
Sure, I'll kick it off, and Thomas can maybe add from an EU perspective. So what we've got here is we already have, if we think about assets, we've got a regulated asset class already. So we're in proper digital share, digital bond really territory. And what that means is that there are pre-existing rules that impose certain requirements. Notably, the one that everybody talks about is there is a requirement under the CSDR, which is a CSD regulation in Europe, which basically says that if you're trading a security on a trading venue, it must be registered in book entry form with a CSD. And what that then means is that if you've got a DLT trading platform that wants to issue one of these, you sort of have to still go through via the CSD to register it, so you're bound to stick to the old traditional methods effectively. This is the sort of problem, and this is one example. There are other punctual examples like this. This is what the EU DLT pilot is trying to solve. It's basically saying, okay, we recognize that DLT has a slightly different structure, and therefore certain rules don't make sense or don't really work. And so let's test out what it would look like if we disapply those rules in the context of DLT-specific projects. And what they do is they allow you to basically apply for a license as a CSD or as a trading venue or as a hybrid of both, enabling then that infrastructure to run a DLT-based both trading and settlement system using DLT. That's the idea behind it. it has some shortcomings, which Thomas can talk about in a moment. The UK has a slightly different problem. It has the same problems and different problems on top, in the sense that every jurisdiction has its own rules as to how you issue a security. So the question about, is it okay to issue a digital security as such, a digital bond, that's a question of local law, even in Europe. And then you harmonize the trading standards under the MiFID framework. So it's the secondary market of it that is harmonized under EU rules. The UK has the same thing, but we on top have common law that governs some certain aspects of the issuance of a security. So what's a bond is a common law question. There is no legislation per se that defines it. It's a whole bunch of cases that over time have defined it. And so the concept of a bond is a little bit fluid. And when you start working through whether a digital bond actually can be created as such, you run into certain issues like, oh, well, you need to do it bearer, you need to do it registered. If you do it bearer, does the requirement on the DLT to hold the crypto asset via a key, does that meet the requirement of holding? Would that constitute a bearer instrument? Or would the DLT be more like a register? And if it's a register, have you met all the requirements that you need? So you run into those practical issues. And again, this is what we're trying to solve in the UK with the FMI sandbox. That's sort of the idea.
So Thomas, EU pilot regime, how is the industry reacting on that? Does it make sense, or is it again something the regulator made in theory but in practice not possible?
First of all, I would disagree that the regulator, the European Commission, created something with MiCA and it's not adopted by the industry. I really think that that's going to happen for MiCA. And the question is if the pilot regime is adopted, is a different one, but that has some specific reasons. As Diego pointed out, you have to differentiate between the primary and the secondary market. And the primary market was always pretty clear that we can use the existing laws, the harmonized existing prospectus regime in Europe, that you can issue a digital security and passport that through Europe. So that was actually already pretty clear. And then the question is if you can issue equity. That's a local law question. It's possible in Switzerland. You have this Wertrechte as we have them in Liechtenstein. It's possible in Austria. It's a question of the jurisdiction if you can issue them. But the primary market, the harmonized part was solved. And then the secondary market, this trading venue challenge. If you look at how our capital markets are organized, they are organized in a very specific way with specific intermediaries addressing the relevant risks, so counterparty risks, for example, or the custodian, actually the CSD, right, who actually custody these kind of instruments, and then you have the trading venues, different type of trading venues. It's extremely highly regulated, and it addresses the issues, and that's why we have efficient capital markets globally, actually, right? So now when you use DLT technologies to reorganize that capital markets, you can actually get rid of some of the intermediaries. And custody is for sure the obvious one, right? Why would you need custody? But also counterparty risks. You can address counterparty risk with technology. So based on that, the European Commission came up with the pilot regime, and it was a pilot regime. It's actually basically offering for a playground, but they said we will not actually risk our working capital markets in Europe. We need these to be operational. So let's provide for a playground. The problem is, there are some challenges, but for me, one of the biggest one is that they limited the issuance volume of the security to 500 million and not the tokenized one. So, for example, you cannot tokenize whatever stock comes to your mind, every blue chip, and I'm not naming one, right? No investment advice, we're all lawyers. So all of these are out of scope. You can actually have really small issuance, right, and use these on their trading venues. And now it's a big surprise for the European regulator that nobody is wanting to play in a playground with not funny toys, right? So that is actually the challenge, the biggest challenge on the one hand, I think, and then there are others who can actually apply. It's limited, it's very heavily regulated, and it's limited time-wise as well, right? So you have a playground where you don't know if it's sustainable. So why would you actually spend a lot of money investing that to try these waters without knowing if you can do that in the future? But it is the right approach. It is the right approach to exempt you from the CSDR regulation. It is the right approach. It just needs, now there is already movements to address these issues, right? That will take time. But actually, and that is a story. Well, I try to be very transparent. I said a lot of good things about Liechtenstein. That, for example, we completely missed, right? The MiCA, we are aiming for having it in force in Liechtenstein as it is in the rest of Europe. But the pilot regime is in force since February 2023, right? And we missed that. So it's not in force in Liechtenstein. You cannot even make use of it. So that's one thing we missed.
Okay, interesting. Maybe, Diego, coming back to you in the UK. I mean, I know a lot of crypto projects, especially exchanges. They, also from the US, they started in the UK. And sometimes they also operate out of the UK. So the question is, this FMI sandbox, does it help this kind of entities, or is it more like for the traditional trading facilities and infrastructures?
No, so the crypto projects are probably crypto. I mean, it depends on which one you're talking about, but mostly the crypto projects that are operating out of the UK for crypto are crypto, and they're not what we call financial instruments projects. And I think this is pretty clear. It doesn't work for crypto projects. So they would need to qualify as financial instruments. This is the whole point. The whole point is to solve for this issue around CSDR and other sort of hurdles that the existing regulatory framework puts up. What I would say is that there is a lot of scope for the technology to be used. And we've seen that there are examples today of uses of the technology in the context of traditional securities in order to optimize certain steps. Movement of high quality liquid assets in the repo space. We've seen, for example, projects where you tokenize deposits and you use that tokenized deposit as a settlement mechanism. So there's a whole layer of what I call non-new asset creation. It's basically the use of DLT as a books and records framework within one or more institutions does not necessarily create a new asset, if that makes sense. So if I, instead of using my old Excel spreadsheet to record transactions, start recording transactions simply using DLT, that may give me efficiencies without me having to create a separate asset. I'm just doing what I was doing. It's just a better system to do it. And we've seen examples of that. And those examples come from the crypto space because they're just much better at it. They've been thinking about it afresh. And what I've seen in some of my clients that are banking institutions is, questions around, we've seen that DEX doing this and that. Do you think we could do that for our trading? Can we do that? We're not creating a new asset. Assets are the same, but can we do something similar for our settlement mechanism? Would that work? And then it's a really interesting question, because then it's about what does MiFID say? What's the rule? And can it actually be met with DLT without creating a change in asset class? That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think now this is a good point to move forward to DeFi regulation, because I mean, I as a lawyer in this space, I very much like the technology, also very much like the energy that people put into decentralization, so making things secure by using decentralized technology. But I'm also worried a bit, I mean, if I look now at the infrastructure side of regulation, I mean, we have the trading, we have the infrastructure, we have the participants directly participating on the DLT technology, and this is now regulated as a licensed activity. I mean, what's then at the end the difference between DeFi, where people say it's completely autonomous, it's decentralized, and a licensed trading system that also has the claim it's DLT-based, it's permissionless or permissioned maybe, but at least it's the same technology. And I mean, Thomas, is DeFi just a marketing language which will be regulated soon, or is there still then, when this DLT trading system exists, a difference between pure DeFi infrastructures and DLT regulated infrastructures?
That is a very crucial point, and that's I think the interesting discussion we have to have now, because the regulatory approaches we see now are regulating individuals, are regulating companies, providing products and services, and even infrastructure and layer ones. That is the old approach, right? That is the approach we had for decades. And it's not really, as you said, it's not really very different from the existing rules. And I do advocate for get a really deep understanding on what this technology could offer. And it starts with what is a sufficient level of decentralization, right? What is really truly DeFi? I think there is no such thing which was like born truly decentralized, right? Even Bitcoin started very centralized. So, but we are getting to a point where we have truly decentralized protocols. So the question is, if we have something which is not under control of a small group of people, which provides for really truly new solutions, and we as lawyers, we see that every day. Like, people come to you using marketing terms. Look, that's actually the same thing as it was with ICOs. We think we are not a security, right? We call it whatever. We call it utility, and that's why we're not a security. But what we are actually doing is we are doing this, and that's very similar. So now they come and say, we are a DeFi project, so we think we are not regulated. And I do advocate for, if there is something truly decentralized and you can address the same risks, and DEXs, that's my easy to understand example. If you have a centralized exchange, you have all of these rules in place to actually address the risks. You don't want to have front running, you don't want to have the counterparty risk, you don't want to have like fake orders and all of that stuff. So that's why you have regulation in place. If you have a truly decentralized exchange where nobody has influence, it's fully it's running on a trustworthy layer one. It's the smart contracts are open source. They're very well done, and they address these risks. Why do you need regulation? Right? There is no need for regulation. There is need maybe for money laundering, like CFT, right? These kind of things. But to operate that trading venue, I don't see the point for regulation if it's really truly decentralized. But that is the question, and that is the next big step. Now we have the same regulatory approaches as we had it for at least hope adopted on this new technology world, right? But the next step is to understand where this technology actually can solve the same issues and then exempt from regulation. And there are examples, like I am from Liechtenstein, so that's what we did, right? We said, where do we have to regulate and where the technology can provide for solutions? But this understanding has to come into the head of the regulators when they create new policies and new legislation, right? It should be driven by that deeply understanding of, because this will actually enable all of the potential of it, right? So that's my point. But that's a long discussion, and I think we should, all of us, should start to advocate in that direction. And not start with, we call our project DeFi, and it's not. We have the master keys, we have the majority of votes, we run 60% of the nodes, right? No, truly DeFi. That's really a good thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Diego, what's your view on that?
Look, from a policy perspective, whether it should be regulated or not, it's a really difficult question, and there are lots of things. What I would say is that sometimes, or most of the times, for efficient large markets, you need intermediating entities that will be acting for those people who don't have sufficient knowledge or expertise, and it needs to be possible for those actors, which are going to be the clients, to have a reliable service and somebody to complain against if something goes wrong. Fundamentally, and this is how it works in institutional markets today. If a pension fund goes to an advisor to pick their stock, they're huge. It's not that they can't do it. It's just that they go for somebody who has the expertise. And there's a client relationship being created with that portfolio picker. And so I think even in those large markets, you see that you need someone with the expertise that you're relying on, because ultimately you are holding funds of consumers that are not investors and have given away their funds. So I think that's the tricky bit from a policy perspective. How do you get the balance right in terms of who is accountable in the end for losses? And I think when we talk about this really kicking off, we're talking about institutional money, not just your savings. It's a proper institutional thing, and at that stage, I think it's really tricky to find the right balance.
I slightly disagree. It's not tricky. It's very simple. If you have a working DEX, and I can figure it out myself. I do it myself. I educate myself. I do it over the weekend. I use it myself. It's my problem. It's my risk if something goes wrong. But if I ask you and I say, Diego, I have no clue how to operate this DEX, right? Here you have 1,000 Swiss francs. Can you please buy me whatever, right? And then you're taking my 1,000 Swiss francs. You are actually taking them in custody. You're changing them to whatever token, right? Then you interact with the DEX on my behalf. For sure, you have to be regulated, right? If you do it as a friend, that's a different story.
But I think my point is that the person who's interacting with the DEX is carrying then the liability of making it of actually doing it properly. And what you don't know, what you can't exclude, is that for some reason you haven't spotted something with the DEX protocol that ultimately leads you to losses. That's a risk that you are, as a pension fund, then carrying. And that's not how the markets work. No pension fund will want to carry this sort of risk. So I'm not thinking retail. I'm thinking big wholesale investors. They don't like carrying that risk, and that's the sort of fundamental point. For these markets to actually work, I think you need wholesale funds, and wholesale investors are risk averse. They don't like to be told, oh, you're going to be sitting on this, and if you're participating on that thing for other people, you need to understand how that DEX works, and can you for sure say that you understand it? You're going to be on the hook for this. So, I think that's sort of the issue, and can you get that balance right? Because if you really want to get adoption, you need to be able to get rid of risk. Ultimately, markets are about getting rid of legal risk and operational risk, and etc. This is why you hire people. This is why you appoint.
But I think we agree on that. I think we just use a different term, because in the end, I'm kind of biased because I'm a board member of the largest pension fund in Liechtenstein as well. So and I'm familiar with these kind of discussions. But a pension fund is highly regulated anyways, and the investment decision of a pension fund is highly regulated. And if a pension fund engages or hires a professional service provider, yes, then we can think about if we need to regulate the service provider. But the point is, there is no individual or person to tackle when you operate, because you don't operate the DEX. You don't do it, right? It's done by the protocol.
Yes, which is why I'm thinking, would a pension? I mean, you answer. You're part of the board. Would a pension fund be happy in saying, yeah, we're happy. We're to participate on this X DEX. We've got our quotas in, they've checked it, they think it's fine, we're happy to go. If something goes wrong, are they happy to carry that risk? I think that's the fundamental question. I think that's where regulation kicks in, because if the DEX was regulated, you'd go, well, it was a regulated DEX, it was a regulated exchange, I was trading like anybody else, I've not taken on board risk that I cannot manage. I think that's the step that you need to overcome for this to be institutional and properly widely adopted. And I think that's the problem that also regulators have. Regulators are coming at it from a retail angle. They're saying, well, we need to protect retail investors. Yes, they do. But I think that's sort of a secondary problem. If you really want to grow this, you need to make it possible for institutional investors to come in. And if you look at the discussion that we're having, the BIS paper on digital securities, on prudential standards, that's basically slapping on a whole raft of potential capital inefficiencies just for using the technology, let alone for using DEX. I mean, that's not even on the cards. So I think this is my problem with it. Regulation enables you to offload risk, because you can, as a participant, say, well, I'm dealing with someone who, this legislation, this jurisdiction is telling me is regulated and safe.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, out of this discussion, I think key is that we maybe can say there is decentralized infrastructure, which is the core, but then on top, the service providers that allow you access to these infrastructures, which anyway a user interface and on top is required. I think there is where regulation kicks in. We are running out of time. We started 5 minutes later. Maybe we can take another 5 minutes, but I think it would be cool to have some questions if there are any. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Guido, and I would love to ask a question out of the perspective of the blockchain project. I would like to go with my blockchain project globally, but if I look to Switzerland, there's a utility token approach, but FINMA is not releasing any paper anymore really to make a token as a utility token. DLT, we have learned, is not coming up. Switzerland is waiting for Europe, for MiCA, and MiCA comes up. So at least all is narrowing our business approach at least. And I would like to ask a very provocative question here. The weapon industry is one of the highly regulated industries in the world, and they are working everywhere, and it works. And there's also aspects of protection. Where is now the path for a blockchain project, the legal path, to go globally? Because what here is presented, and we're going more and more in narrowing it, is for me as a project leader of different new projects, not attractive. So where is the path really to work globally and serve what we have been all coming up for within this regulatory environment and this approach?
Who wants to take the question?
I can. I mean, it's very simple. It's not. There is no path at the moment. It's a stepped approach. We started in Switzerland. We started in Liechtenstein. Now we have Europe. We hope to see some kind of same level of regulation. Talking again about equivalency, and actually for sure Europe is hoping up on that Brussels effect. That same happened to GDPR. That others will come up with the same level of regulation or similar regulation. So we are on that path, but it's not around the corner. And it's not tomorrow, and nobody knows how this will actually look like, right? So, but to give you an idea, if you look at how securities are regulated, and I would actually draw the attention of your counterparties when you discuss these issues, maybe to the securities world and not to the weapon industry, because that might be a little bit of a harsh comparison. And in the end, I don't know if these solutions or these like regulations are somehow similar to what we have, because that is for sure one of the most highly regulated areas, weapon industry. And it's even like, I don't know if you're familiar with the dual use concept. So even if you have something which is used in a civil way, but also could be potentially used for military purposes, you have to have a specific permission to export it. So if you think about that, it's actually worse. Like there you cannot do anything without permission of a government to export your product. So I think that is not a good approach, to be very honest. And the other thing is, let's work together on that. To be very honest, let's work together on that. The industry, and we are organized. We have like these kind of amazing conferences where we come up with ideas. I hope that we will get some information out of the roundtables, right? We should advocate for good regulatory approaches. And we should also, and like, we all know for years we had these discussions that we don't need regulation at all, right? We don't need regulation, we are technology only. That's not true. We are in 2023, everybody now agrees on that we need sensible regulation. And now it's the time to advocate for good regulatory approaches globally. And I totally agree that this is the hopefully end result. But if you look at the securities world, there it's also the traditional answer of a lawyer. It depends on the jurisdictions you're aiming at, and it's complicated. But in the end, you know which markets you can address and under which circumstances. And let's work for that, right? Let's work for sensible regulation globally, and then let's advocate for that. That is what I try and do in a lot of, I'm also the chair of the board of INATBA, a European-driven association where we advocate for good regulatory approaches. I think that is really needed now.
Diego, something to add?
Just a 1 minute remark. I think the regulatory framework is actually helping at the moment in the sense that it's converging to there being regulation that will allow these assets properly. A few years back, it wasn't clear that jurisdictions would allow them. If you take away the US, I think you are seeing a patchwork at the moment. We're then going to see convergence with MiCA, with the UK regime. Singapore is creating a regime. And you'll end up with what the finance industry does, which is having to get licenses in certain hubs. But I think there will be a path to your blockchain project.
Maybe one last question here.
Sure, thank you. In the first part of a question for a colleague from Clifford. In the first part of the panel, you mentioned the distinction between backed and unbacked crypto assets, where backed crypto assets are like stablecoin, unique asset reference tokens, or memory tokens, and unbacked crypto assets are not very clear to me what you mean. Like, is it everything else? Do you put in the
Everything else, yeah.
So, okay,
Utilities.
how could you put in the same group Ethereum and Bitcoin that have no issuer? You cannot identify a legal entity issuing the token, and a utility token that is issued by a company for fundraising purposes, and in the end it gives a certain kind of right towards the issuer for the person.
I think the question is, what type of right does it give you? If it gives you a debt obligation, then it's probably a bond, certainly under English law, and then you in security space. If it's any other type of sort of utility obligation where you get, like, I don't know, some sort of service or something, that still falls within. If it falls within MiCA and it's not excluded, it's just not an whatever is not an asset reference token. It's not a stable coin. Falls is the third catch-all bucket.
And it's not a security.
And it's not a security. That's my point.
Of course, but MiCA has a clear definition of what a utility token is, and also the path to issue it. I was just curious why you put them in the same group. And also there was another thing you mentioned, that MiCA creating this framework for the issuance of utility tokens is trying to create a market. I would really not agree with the statement in the sense that the market for utility token offerings has been there since 2017. Has been a Wild West. There has been scam. It was an immature market. It is maturing now, but still the phenomena never ended. And even now, even in a bear market, there are still utility token offerings that are launchpad, that are platforms that are whose business model is just to launch tokens, and they have the volumes. And so it's there. I mean, the regulatory approach is just to regulate something that is an existing phenomenon, not to create a new one.
I think the ambition is under MiCA to try and equate these sort of offerings to what you've got in the securities markets. And I think if you compare the proportional size of the securities market offerings in terms of volumes, you'll dwarf those. I agree with you. There are some utility token offerings, but they are, compared to what you've got in the security space, just very, very tiny. And so my point is, Europe is created a framework so that people can start issuing things, and so that you can actually build up a market. Whether that's going to be a significant market, yes.
Okay, so I think we have to wrap up here, but I'm pretty sure there are other questions. I mean, we are all around here at the conference, so feel free to approach us and have a further discussion. So thank you very much for attending, and I wish you a good conference.